Why does Jacques Lacan talk about the voice as an object? Of course, Lacan also speaks about the gaze as an object, and as many are familiar, he adds gaze and voice to the illustrious list of objects that Freud had already noted in terms of the so-called psychosexual stages of development. In other words, the oral, the anal, the phallic objects. So this is intriguing. Initially, it seems somewhat counterintuitive because one would have to say that voice and gaze don't seem, at a first glance, at first consideration, to be objects in the way that these other bodily objects, these more clearly physical objects, seem to be objects. So how do we get around this quandary? And what exactly does it mean when Lacan talks about voice in particular as an object? I'm going to focus more on object here than gaze. The notion of the gaze has received a great deal of attention in the literature. The voice less so, perhaps with the exception of Mladen Dollar's crucial book, A Voice and Nothing More. But let's start then with the question, in what way would we think about the voice as an object? A very counterintuitive idea. Well, perhaps the best way to go about thinking about this is to note that Lacan, as I've said before, is a psychiatrist before he is a psychoanalyst. And it seems imminently possible that within the domain of psychiatric work, particularly with psychotic patients, one might be led to conclude that both voice and gaze, in as much as they can be intrusive, dare I say it, objects from the side of the other, that both voice and gaze assume the weight and significance of objects. If we want to substantiate this claim, we can turn to Jacques-Alain Millet's chapter in the later Lacan, where he talks about, precisely in a chapter called Jacques Lacan and the Voice. He says there, what was it that put Lacan onto this lengthening of the Freudian list of objects with these two new objects, voice and gaze? The answer is simple: clinical experience. It is a clinical experience in which gaze and voice manifest themselves in separate forms, clearly characterized by their exteriority with regard to the subject. So there's a first indication, their exteriority, which is emphasized by Jacques-Alain Millet, their exteriority with regard to the subject. He continues to say the following: this means that it is the clinical experience of psychosis that led Lacan to lengthen the Freudian list. We can say that in a certain way, these objects were already known to psychiatrists, and that the theory of the voice and gaze as objects A comes from the crossing of Lacan's psychiatric experience with Freud's theory of stages. So this is kind of a nice way of putting it, like if you overlap Lacan as psychiatrist with a reading of Freud's stages, you start to see how it seems to make a lot of sense that these external objects of voice and gaze, and also let's emphasize, they would presumably also be intrusive and potentially traumatic objects, entities that make their way towards the subject. Jacques-Alain Millet continues and he says, it is from the phenomena of mental automatism, so named since de Clerambault, from the phenomena of mental automatism, in other words, disturbances in psychical experiences, that Lacan extracted the object voice. Here, certainly within the domain of psychiatry and psychosis, one speaks of voices. Although these voices may seem immaterial, they are nevertheless perfectly real to the subject. They are even what the subject cannot doubt, despite the fact that maybe no one else may perceive them. Their sonorous materiality is a crucial facet here, although it's not, he emphasizes, the only aspect. So let's do an initial little call out and qualification. Often in Lacanian accounts of the voice, we have a kind of attention to the sonorous dimension of the voice, that within the voice which escapes signification. Now that, at the same time, remains a crucial facet of the Lacanian dimension of the voice, but it is also not enough to understand precisely what is going on in terms of this prioritization of the voice. The fact of being addressed by the voice, as I'll discuss in more detail as we continue, is going to be crucial. But just to highlight here again, the object nature of gaze and voice has something to do with the externality of these experiences, not just the radical externality and the intrusiveness of them, but presumably the possibility that they can be traumatic. Interestingly, I've never heard Lacanians make reference to it, but there's a wonderful moment in Fanon when he talks about in a dying colonialism, and he talks about the experience, the type of experience, I suppose you could say traumatic, intrusive experience of Algerian radio on Algerian listeners, not Algerian radio, French colonial radio in the Algerian context on native Algerians. He says, and Fanon is looking at psychiatric literature. And of course, let's also remember that this is something that Fanon and Lacan have in common. They're both psychiatrists in a sense. Fanon says, prior to 1954, monographs written on Algerian suffering from hallucination constantly pointed out the presence of the external action phase of highly aggressive and hostile radio voices. These metallic, cutting, insulting, disagreeable voices all have for the Algerian an accusing, inquisitorial character. The radio, colonial radio, assumes a highly alienating meaning in the field of the pathological. And before 1954, in the psychopathological realm, the radio was an evil object, anxiogenic and accursed, an evil object. So that's fascinating in a number of ways. There we have a sense, although Fanon technically is speaking about the radio, you could say that he's coming pretty close to thinking about the voice as an intrusive, anxiogenic, and pathology-inducing externality. In other words, he's coming very close to saying something about the voice as object, which is very similar to how Lacan is thinking about it. Now let's if we're trying to grasp this paradoxical quality of why voice and gaze are like objects, we've started to do that a little bit. Another idea that came to mind is I don't know why this particularly came to mind, but there's some film versions of what was happening in Guantanamo Bay in the years after 9/11, where there were a whole lot of people who had been arrested, presumably people who were suspected of some whatever Al-Qaeda activities. But one of the means of torture was to not allow people to sleep. And one of the ways that you would prevent people from sleeping was to play very loud, aggressive sounds, music, in a way that sound presumably was so disruptive that we can imagine how it would almost itself attain a kind of object quality. So staying with this idea of the object quality, of this intrusive external object quality, let's think a little bit, and here as in elsewhere in psychoanalysis, it helps to think a little bit about myths. If we wanted to think about the object quality of gaze and voice, think about how gaze and voice can do something to you. In other words, they're not simply a means, a way of conveying something. They attain a certain kind of object quality. So if we had to think about the gaze of Medusa, this is something that can do something to you. It burns into you. Let's think about the voice, the mesmerizing voice that can transfix or seduce. We might think of the Song of the Sirens, the sound that would bring naive sailors in and end up in some kind of perilous destiny for them. We can also think about the seductive grain of the voice, certain facets of the quality of the voice that might take on an erotic or appealing quality. What I'm trying to get at here is that gaze and voice are never merely neutral vehicles of perception. They're invariably loaded in some or other way, and they're loaded in a way which exceeds signification. They're a potent means of conveying, in the examples I've given, aggression, but also potentially a seductive role or even affection. They could be wished for, desired, or alternatively resented and avoided. In other words, they're already starting to take on the psychical dimension of objects in as much as they could be wished for, desired, resented, hated. There's a wonderful, I think it's a footnote in Erik Erikson, who's not really a theorist that is often cited by Lacanians, but I think it's in his Childhood and Society book, the same book that's got the famous stages of development that he proposes, that he cites a passage of, I think it's a kid going, "God damn your eyes, stop staring at me in this moment of my humiliation." And this interesting way of like, God damn your eyes, once again connotes how the evil eye, should we say? Not that Erickson is talking about the evil eye there, but the eye that is seeing one, or the voice to extrapolate, that is addressing one, attain a kind of hated object status, which we would rather erase, that we would rather get away from. Of course, one example that may have already occurred to you is in Dune, both the book and I guess the films that have followed, we see voice take on voice as an aggressive instrument, as an instrument of war. We have this where people use voice as a kind of projectile, as a kind of object with which damage can be done. And although that's clearly a science fiction example, the voice as an object with which violence can be done is suggestive. When I've written elsewhere about Fanon, and actually in relationship to the same essay, I made the point that these days it's not counterintuitive or at all odd to talk about the male gaze, the sexist gaze, misogynist gaze, patriarchal gaze, the colonial gaze. This is an idea that has entered the common currency of cultural theory. But do we think as much about the colonial voice or the racist voice or the voice that addresses you? Can I help you? This kind of tonality of voice, which does involve an addressee function and an interpolative function of locating someone in a place which is difficult to defend against, gives us something also about how voice can be an assault of sorts, just like in the Dune, well, not just like, but the Dune example, I think, illustrates voice as weapon, voice as traumatic trajectory of sorts. The other thought that occurred to me when we're trying to understand voice as object and voice as an object capable of conveying aggression or seduction or allure or eroticism or appeal or invitation was just a kind of childhood memory, which I guess many of us may have, is having to learn at a certain point when one was growing up that you mustn't stare too much at other people. And I think it's a fundamentally gendered form of socialization, because for me, there was a realization that if you stare at another male's eyes for too long, this could be, and presumably would, be perceived as an act of aggression. And I'm guessing that switched in gender roles, there's also the danger that one must be aware of and learn not to do, particularly as a woman, is not to gaze too long at another person's eyes in fear of being seen as being overly seductive. So this gives us another more everyday, almost kind of phenomenological sense to how gaze and voice might start to not only operate as certain objects, but objects of drive, right? Because they're involving hate and love and the wish potentially for repetition, and also a certain series of prohibitions and rules that one should internalize and not take further. So back to our idea of how to think about these as objects. Voice, like the gaze, can certainly possess a sexual charge, just as it can serve, as any number of horror movies will show us, as a vehicle of anxiety. In Lacanian terms, then, both voice and gaze operate as instantiations of object A, that is, as an object cause both of desire or of anxiety. Both voice and gaze can do that. They can incur a great deal of anxiety, and they can also incur and substantiate, in a sense, a relationship of desire. Okay, so if that is true, if one can wish to possess a loving or desirous gaze, or if one can wish to possess a voice, a consoling voice, for example, or an inviting voice, these would be wanted and one would wish to possess them as kind of good objects. Then we can see how they are also akin to objects of the drive. One could likewise, and we've already given an example of this, how one might wish to destroy or obliterate both a hateful gaze or an anxiety-provoking gaze, or a hateful voice or an anxiety-provoking voice. Now, interestingly, one of the things that is so important about voice, and up until now I've been kind of using voice and gaze in pretty much the same way, is that Lacan will tell us in Seminar 11, the ears are the only aperture of drive, so to speak, that cannot be blocked up. In other words, there is a sense in which maybe one can try to avoid the gaze. There's a sense in which maybe one can avoid many different influences of the other, but to be addressed, to make oneself not hear the other, is something which is quite difficult. In other words, one of the fundamental domains or experiences of being interpolated or being addressed or made the addressee of the voice is that it is very difficult to modulate or avoid that. And of course, this takes us all the way back to the earliest moments, I suppose we could say, of child development, where to be addressed by a voice that doesn't quite make sense, that one doesn't know what it is saying, is a crucial facet of that experience. So we'll go on to develop that a little bit.